The morning of September 12th, 1683, arrived in Vienna the way mornings arrive in besieged cities. Not with the clean promise of a new day, but with the accumulated weight of 60 days of everything that had come before it. The smell hit first. Smoke from 100 small fires the Ottoman engineers kept burning through the night to light their digging work. The sulphurous residue of powder from the previous day's cannon exchanges, and underneath all of it, the deeper and more terrible odour of a city that had been dying by inches for 2 months. The smell of inadequate sanitation, of bodies buried too quickly in too shallow graves, of food stores that had been calculated for 3 weeks and were now in their 8th. From the towers of St. Stephen's Cathedral, which still stood in the centre of the city despite everything the Ottoman gunners had thrown at it, a man could look west and see the Ottoman siege lines stretching in an enormous crescent from the Danube in the north to the Vienna River in the south. A tightening iron ring around the city's throat, studded with gun emplacements and the entrance shafts of tunnels that had been burrowing under the walls for the better part of 6 weeks. The ring was beautiful in its terrible way, the way that anything organized at enormous scale and directed with intelligence toward a single lethal purpose is beautiful to those who have no reason to be afraid of it. The 30,000 or so survivors inside Vienna had very good reason. But on the heights above all of this, on the ridge of Kahlenberg mountain that looked down over the entire theatre of the siege, the way a theatre's upper gallery looks down over the stage, something was moving that the Ottoman commanders had perhaps not fully accounted for, and would not fully account for until it was too late to do anything about it. 70,000 soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had spent the previous evening moving into position along the Kahlenberg Ridge, guided by torchlight and the sound of cannon fire below. Their progress measured in the painful increments of men and horses and artillery pieces being hauled up slopes that were not designed to accommodate them. They were exhausted, underfed, and operating in some cases on maps that bore only a passing relationship to the actual terrain they were trying to navigate. But they were there, and at their head, on a white horse that would be visible from a significant distance once the light improved, was the King of Poland. This was the moment that 150 years of Ottoman westward advance had been building toward. Not the siege. The siege was almost over one way or the other. Not the diplomacy, not the treaties, not the decades of skirmishing and raiding and border negotiation that had characterized the Ottoman-Habsburg relationship since Suleiman the Magnificent had stood on this same ground in 1529 and decided, reluctantly, that Vienna was not going to fall to him that year. The moment was this: 2 civilizations at the absolute limit of their reach, one having pushed west as far as logistics and momentum and faith could carry it, the other having assembled, for the first time in a generation, a coalition large enough and unified enough to push back. What happened between dawn and dusk on September 12th, 1683, did not simply save Vienna. It reversed the direction of a historical current that had been flowing in one direction for 4 centuries, and sent it flowing the other way, permanently and irreversibly, for the 2.5 centuries that followed. The Ottoman Empire never again besieged a European city. It never again came this close to the heart of the continent. The tide that had risen so far and so fast hit its high water mark on the hills above Vienna, paused for a single day of extraordinary violence, and began the long recession that would not end until the empire itself ceased to exist in 1922. All of that began here, on a mountain, in the dark before dawn, with a Polish king checking his armor and a city below him burning its last reserves of hope that someone would come. Someone had come. They had been coming for 150 years before they arrived outside Vienna. And to understand the weight of September 12th, 1683, you have to understand what 150 years of unbroken Ottoman advance felt like to the people standing in its path. Not as a military problem, not as a diplomatic challenge, not as a geopolitical situation to be managed with treaties and strategic marriages and the careful balancing of interests that characterized European statecraft in this period. As a force. As something that felt less like an opposing army than like weather. Something you could not negotiate with, could not outlast by waiting it out, could only survive if you happened not to be in its immediate path and hoped it would move in a different direction. They had taken Constantinople in 1453, and that had changed something fundamental about the Christian understanding of what was possible. Constantinople had stood for 1,000 years. It had survived attacks that should have destroyed it: plague, civil war, crusader assault, multiple Ottoman sieges before the one that finally succeeded. It was the city that was not supposed to fall, and then it fell, and the psychological shock of that reversal rippled through Europe for generations. If Constantinople could fall, what couldn't? Mehmed II had then pushed south into Greece, east into Anatolia, north toward the Danube. His successors had continued. They conquered Bulgaria. They absorbed Serbia. They dismantled what remained of the Hungarian kingdom at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, killing the king and most of his court in an afternoon. They occupied most of Hungary and established the Ottoman frontier less than 100 miles east of Vienna. They had the Balkans. They had the breadbasket of Central Europe. They had built the most sophisticated military machine in the world, a system that combined professional elite infantry, the Janissaries, taken as children from Christian families and made into something their original families would not have recognized, with feudal cavalry, specialized siege engineers, a supply and logistics network that could sustain armies of 100,000 men across thousands of miles of difficult terrain, and a religious conviction that transformed military service into something closer to vocation than profession. Suleiman the Magnificent had brought all of this to the gates of Vienna in 1529, and the city had survived not because it was strong enough to defeat him, but because autumn arrived too quickly, and his supply lines were too extended, and the walls proved more resistant than he had planned for. And so he had pulled back, and the moment had passed. But it had not been forgotten. The Golden Apple, Ottoman commanders called Vienna, the prize that sat at the center of Christian Europe, the capture of which would open the continent's interior to Ottoman expansion the way a key opens a lock. For 150 years after 1529, the Golden Apple had sat just out of reach, and every Ottoman Grand Vizier who looked west had thought about it. The man who decided to reach for it in 1683 was Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, and the decision was as much personal as it was strategic. He was not a fool. He had served the Ottoman state for decades, had fought campaigns in Poland and Ukraine, had administered provinces and negotiated treaties, and understood, in a practical way, what military operations of this scale required. But he was also ambitious, in a particular way that ambitious men in positions of supreme power often are. Not simply ambitious for military victory, but ambitious for his own legacy, for his own place in the story the empire told about itself. He wanted to be the man who finally took the Golden Apple. And when the conditions seemed to align in 1682, when Hungarian Protestants, under the leadership of Imre Tököly, rose against their Habsburg overlords and sought Ottoman support, providing a pretext for intervention in Habsburg territory, he decided that the moment had come. In the spring of 1683, Kara Mustafa moved west from Belgrade with a force that Ottoman documentation recorded at approximately 170,000 men at the campaign's outset, though the number that actually arrived before Vienna was likely somewhat smaller due to the normal attrition of a long march. The army was everything an Ottoman military force of this period could be. Janissary infantry in their distinctive white felt caps, disciplined and lethal, and trained from childhood to regard combat as their defining purpose. Sipahi feudal cavalry from every province of the empire, supplemented by Crimean Tatar auxiliaries who could range across a battlefield with a speed and ferocity that regular cavalry rarely matched. Specialized units dedicated to siege engineering, to mining and countermining, to artillery and supply, and the 1,000 logistical functions that keeping an army of this size functional required. It was the largest Ottoman army assembled in the 17th century, and it moved with the confidence of a force that had not experienced a strategic defeat in living memory. What it did not carry was its heaviest artillery. This was Kara Mustafa's first, and in many ways most consequential miscalculation. The decision was not irrational. Heavy bombards slowed an army enormously, as the 1529 campaign had demonstrated, when the delay caused by moving heavy guns had contributed to the timing problems that forced Suleiman's withdrawal. Kara Mustafa wanted speed. He wanted to arrive before Vienna could be reinforced and resupplied. He wanted to catch the Habsburgs unprepared. And so he left the largest guns behind and marched fast. And he arrived before Vienna in July 1683, to find that Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg had spent the intervening months doing exactly what a competent defensive commander with advance warning does: reinforcing the walls, storing supplies, training militia, raising the suburbs to deny cover to attackers, and organizing a garrison that understood it was going to be asked to hold an impossible position for an unspecified period of time, and had decided, collectively, to do it anyway. Starhemberg had also witnessed what happened to the population of Perchtoldsdorf, a nearby town, when they chose to surrender to Ottoman terms. They had been massacred. The lesson was not subtle. So when Kara Mustafa's herald arrived at the gates of Vienna on July 14, 1683, with the traditional demand for surrender, Starhemberg sent the herald back without a written reply. His answer was the sound of the gates closing. Starhemberg was a man of specific and uncomplicated convictions, and one of them was that the walls of Vienna would hold as long as the men on them held, and the men on them would hold as long as he was among them. He moved along the walls every day, every night, in all weather, in all conditions. The visible presence of a commander who had made the same calculation his garrison had made and was prepared to live with the consequences. When a soldier was found asleep on watch, a capital offence in a siege, because a sleeping sentry is a door left ajar, Starhemberg ordered him shot. Not to make an example, to make a fact. On the other side of the walls, Kara Mustafa confronted the reality of what it meant to have no heavy guns to breach fortifications that had been designed, in their most recent phase of construction, specifically to resist artillery. He could not knock the walls down. He could not storm them frontally with any reasonable expectation of success. The defenders were well supplied with shot and powder, and the peculiar focused ferocity of people who understood that the walls were the only thing between them and the fate of Perchtoldsdorf. What he could do was dig. Ottoman engineers were among the best siege specialists in the world, and they went to work with the methodical patience of men who had done this before in harder conditions against stronger defences. Tunnels radiated from the Ottoman lines toward the foundations of Vienna's walls, each one advancing by feet and then yards and then dozens of yards under the earth, where they would eventually be packed with explosives and detonated, collapsing sections of wall that could then be assaulted. The defenders responded with counter-tunnels, listening for the sound of Ottoman digging in the dark below their feet, and responding by digging toward the sound, hoping to intercept the tunnel before it reached the wall. The Saxon engineer Georg Rimpler organized this effort until he was killed in late July, when an Ottoman mine detonated close enough to collapse the ceiling of the tunnel he was working in. The defenders buried him and continued digging. This was the situation, grinding, exhausting, daily attritional horror that John III Sobieski of Poland had been watching from a distance and preparing to intervene in since July. He was 54 years old, heavily built, and carried the particular authority of a man who has spent 30 years fighting on horseback and has the physical record of it to show. He had made his military reputation fighting the Ottomans in the Ukraine in the early 1670s, and the Tatars who served as Ottoman auxiliaries knew his name and were not pleased to hear reports that he was personally leading the relief army. When his intelligence officers intercepted Tatar communications and translated the message, "By Allah, the king is really among us," Sobieski read it with satisfaction. Fear in an enemy's intelligence reports is information. He had arrived at Kahlenberg on the evening of September 11th, completing a march that had brought 70,000 men through the Vienna woods at a pace that had left the horses eating leaves because the supply wagons had been left behind to maintain speed. His men were hungry, his horses were underfed, and when he climbed to the ridge and looked at the terrain below through the fading light of a September evening, he discovered that it bore only a loose relationship to the maps he had been given. He threw the maps away. It was not petulance. It was the decision of a man who understood that fighting from incorrect information is more dangerous than fighting from no information at all, and who had been in enough difficult situations to trust his own eyes over other people's documentation. He spent the remaining hours of daylight looking at the actual terrain, the vineyards and their low stone walls, the villages and their brick buildings that would channel movement into predictable corridors, the slope of the ground and its implications for cavalry that would need to build speed before impact, the relationship between the Ottoman siege lines and the hilltop he was standing on. And then he called his commanders together and gave them the revised plan. The Austrians and Saxons under Charles of Lorraine would hold the left flank and begin attacking early in the morning, pinning Ottoman forces and working their way toward the centre. The German imperial contingents would advance in the middle through the most difficult terrain, keeping the Ottoman centre engaged. The Poles, and specifically the 18,000 cavalry Sobieski had positioned on the right flank, would be the decisive stroke, held until the moment the Ottoman line was fully committed and unable to respond effectively, and then released down the slope. His aide asked when that moment would come. Sobieski looked out at the lights of the Ottoman camp below, the fires burning in the siege trenches, the distant and already dimming lights of Vienna beyond them. He had fought the Ottomans for 30 years. He knew how they thought, how they moved, how they responded to pressure on one front when there was simultaneous pressure on another. He knew about the Janissaries locked in their siege trenches facing Vienna, unable to redeploy quickly. He knew about the lack of a defensive perimeter facing the hills, the absence of earthworks that would have given the Ottoman covering army a position to fight from rather than fighting in open terrain. "I will know it when I see it," he said. "Make sure you are ready before I do." The night of September 11th was not peaceful. Nights during sieges are rarely peaceful, and this one had the particular quality of tension that comes when both sides know something decisive is coming and are each trying to complete their immediate objective before it arrives. The Ottoman tunnel crews worked by torchlight in their subterranean passages, driving their excavations closer to the walls of Vienna with the focus of men who had been told that a few more hours of work might be enough. The defenders above them listened and dug and prayed and maintained the watch that Kahlenberg's standing orders required on pain of death. Inside the city, civilians who had survived 60 days of siege through a combination of stubbornness and terrible luck listened to the familiar sounds of distant cannon and close digging and tried to sleep. On Kahlenberg Mountain, 70,000 men made whatever preparations they could in the limited time available. The German and Austrian contingents had arrived first and had somewhat better positions than the Poles, who had come up last through the hardest terrain and arrived tired in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. The cavalry, the winged hussars among them, checked their equipment by firelight, with the particular attention that experienced soldiers give to things they are going to depend on in the morning. The wings themselves, great arching frames of wood and feathers that rose from the saddle harness over the rider's shoulders, were inspected for damage and adjusted where necessary. The lances were long, 5 to 6 meters of hardened wood with steel points, and could not be tested in the darkness and the crowded hillside. But the men who held them knew by feel whether their grip was right. Pistols were loaded, swords checked, armor straps tightened. Horses that had been eating leaves for 2 days were given whatever grain could be found and were spoken to in the quiet way that men speak to horses before battles, not expecting to be understood and perhaps not believing they would be. Before dawn, Mark of Aviano climbed the hill to the ruins of the small church of St. Joseph on the Kahlenberg Ridge and celebrated Mass in the open air, with the sounds of the siege carrying up from the valley below and the first suggestion of dawn beginning to grey the eastern horizon. Sobieski was present, not as a spectator, but as a participant, serving at the Mass in the manner of a Catholic layman attending his parish church on a Sunday morning, which was not the display of piety it might have looked like from the outside, but rather the act of a man for whom faith and military action had been integrated into a single practice over 30 years of fighting wars he believed were just. He received communion. He prayed. Then he walked back to his horse and mounted up and looked down at the valley where the Ottoman army was already stirring in the pre-dawn dark, the first of their drums beginning to beat, the first of their fires being stoked against the morning chill. In the Ottoman camp below, Kara Mustafa was receiving intelligence reports that made the situation clear. The relief army was on the heights. It was larger than he had hoped, and it would attack in the morning. He had 2 options. He could consolidate his forces and fight a full defensive battle against the relief army, but this would require withdrawing the Janissaries from the siege trenches, which would mean abandoning weeks of tunnelling work at the moment when the mines were close to ready. Or he could split his forces, keep the Janissaries in the trenches, use the Vienna end of the operation to take the city in the time remaining, and fight the relief army with his covering forces. He chose to split. He had good reasons. By his engineers' estimates, the tunnels were within hours of being positioned to destroy critical sections of the Vienna Wall. If the mines could be detonated before the battle on the hills reached a conclusion, the city might fall before the relief army's attack could be decisive. It was a calculation that assumed his covering forces could hold the heights long enough, and that the relief army would attack with the slowness and organizational difficulty that European armies of this period typically displayed in complex terrain. Both assumptions were wrong. The drums began at 4 in the morning, Not the distant, rhythmic sound that the defenders on Kahlenberg had been hearing for days as background noise, but sudden, loud, everywhere at once, the percussion of an Ottoman preemptive attack rolling up the hillside before the relief army had fully completed its deployment. Kara Mehmed Pasha, commanding the Ottoman right wing with 10,000 men, had decided that the best way to deal with the artillery positions being established by Count James Leslie on the Kahlenberg slope was to attack them before they were operational. His men came up the defiles in the pre-dawn dark with the kind of aggression that men produce when they are ordered to attack uphill in the dark against an enemy whose exact position they cannot see, which is a particularly demanding kind of aggression because it requires suppressing the instinctive caution that darkness and uncertainty normally produce. Charles of Lorraine was already awake and already moving. He had been awake since before the drums, because he was the kind of commander who slept less than his men did, and who used the time to walk his lines and think about what the morning would require. When the Ottoman drums changed their pattern, when the attack rhythm started, he did not consult anyone or call a council. He turned to his officers and gave the orders he had already worked out, and the Austro-Saxon left wing began its descent into the valley. The fighting in the vineyard country below the ridge was not the clean, organized battle that battle paintings depict. It was building to building and wall to wall work through terrain that was specifically designed to channel and slow the movement of large formations, through olive trees and hop gardens and the waist-high stone walls that divided the individual plots, past farmhouses whose cellars had been converted into Ottoman defensive positions and whose upper floors had been turned into firing platforms. Every stone wall was a minor fortification. Every building was a problem that had to be either cleared or bypassed. The German infantry who advanced through this terrain in the morning hours were doing the kind of work that the winged hussars couldn't do. Close, slow, methodical work against defenders who had prepared their positions and were not inclined to give them up voluntarily. They pushed through it anyway. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon and begun to burn off the morning mist, the Ottoman right wing was under severe pressure, its formations fragmenting under the sustained advance of troops who outnumbered them and had the advantage of momentum. But the Ottoman centre was intact, and it was substantial. Ibrahim Pasha of Buda commanded roughly 23,000 men along the ridgelines above the Döblingerbach and Krottenbach streams, positioned in terrain that was less forgiving to attackers than the vineyard country the Austrians were fighting through. His forces were a mix of cavalry, paramilitary infantry, and janissary units, better organized and better positioned than the right wing, anchored on natural terrain features that gave them fields of fire in multiple directions and made the kind of flanking attacks that might have dislodged them quickly much more difficult to execute. Kara Mustafa himself was here, in the center, where the green banner of the Prophet was flying on the Türkenschanze, the Turkish earthworks that had been thrown up on a prominent hillock that was now the moral center of the Ottoman defensive line, the point that both sides understood had to be held or taken for the day to be decided. The Bavarians under Max Emanuel and the Franconians under Prince Waldeck advanced against this center with the steadiness that professional infantry develops over years of drill, taking casualties from Ottoman cannon and musket fire without breaking formation, closing the distance in the measured way of troops who have been told that their job is not to take the position in the first rush, but to keep the defenders fixed in place while the decisive blow falls somewhere else. They were doing exactly what Sobieski needed them to do, and they knew it, and knowing it made the casualties easier to absorb, not less painful, but more purposeful, which is a different thing entirely. Deep in the siege trenches below the walls of Vienna, a young janissary had been digging since midnight. He did not know his name has not survived. What survives is the account of what happened in those trenches during the hours of the battle above, pieced together from the testimony of survivors on both sides. The moment when the sounds from the Kahlenberg, which had been growing louder since before dawn, changed quality in a way that the men underground could feel through the soil even before they could hear it clearly. The deep percussion of a battle involving tens of thousands of men becoming audible even through the earth. Some of the janissaries in the trenches asked for orders. Some asked what was happening. The officers told them to keep digging. The walls of Vienna were close. The mines were nearly ready. Keep digging. The orders were wrong, but they were not unreasonable. The mines were nearly ready, and Kara Mustafa, watching the battle on the hills with the attention of a man who has staked everything on a single calculation, still believed that the calculation might be correct, that the walls would come down before the relief army's advance became irreversible, that the city would fall, that the relief army would arrive too late to matter. It was the belief of a man who had pushed this far and was not temperamentally inclined to accept that he had pushed too far. By midday, the Ottoman right wing had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Charles of Lorraine had driven it back to the banks of the Derblingerbach, scattered and disorganized, unable to provide any meaningful support to Ibrahim Pasha's center. The Austro-Saxon forces were now swinging to their right to apply pressure to Ibrahim's flank, a movement that changed the dynamics of the center battle significantly. Suddenly, Ibrahim's 23,000 men were not simply facing pressure from the front, but were beginning to feel the compression of a force working around their left side, while Waldeck and Max Emanuel maintained their frontal advance. The Türkenschanze, with its green banner and its symbolic weight, was the focal point of the Austrian ambition. Kara Mustafa saw this and rode to the centre himself, taking the holy banner in his hand, the sacred standard of the Prophet that had been blessed by religious authority and handed to him in Belgrade before the campaign began, as a physical representation of the divine mandate under which this entire enormous enterprise operated. He held it and called his men to rally, and some of them did, and the fighting around the Türkenschanze became the most intense and the most personal of the day's fighting. The kind of combat where men who have been advancing stop thinking about formations and tactics and start thinking about the immediate problem of staying alive. But Sobieski was watching all of this from the ridge with the attention of a chess player watching the board resolve into a configuration he has been waiting for. And what he saw, in the middle of the afternoon, with the Ottoman right destroyed, the centre compressed and fighting on two fronts, and Kara Mustafa personally committed to holding a single hilltop position, was the moment he had described to his aide the night before. He saw it. The Poles had been waiting for hours. Not patiently. Patience is not the word for what cavalry does when it has been told that it will be the decisive stroke and is watching a battle develop below it without being part of it. The horses restless, the riders' attention entirely focused on the fight they have been told they will join at the right moment. But they had waited because Sobieski had told them to wait, and because Sobieski's reputation for knowing when to release his cavalry was one of the reasons he commanded the confidence of men who had options about which commanders to follow. At around 4 in the afternoon, probing attacks by individual units of Polish cavalry had tested the Ottoman left flank and found it weak. The Crimean Tatar cavalry that should have screened this side of the Ottoman position had pulled back from the initial exchanges, unwilling or unable to hold their ground against the weight of the Polish advance units. The Tatar Khan, who had his own intelligence about who was leading the relief army, had reportedly said, when informed that Sobieski himself was there, By Allah, the king is really among us." The Tatars' subsequent performance suggested that this recognition had not improved their morale. At approximately 6 in the evening, the order went out. 18,000 cavalry formed on the slopes of the Kahlenberg in 4 great contingents, 3 Polish and 1 Imperial, and began to move. The sound that this produced, the sound of 18,000 horses beginning to move at the same moment in the same direction, was described by eyewitnesses on both sides in elemental terms. The kind of language people reach for when the vocabulary of ordinary experience does not contain what they have witnessed. Earthquake, thunderbolt, the voice of God. The sound built as the formation gathered speed, passing through the stages of walking, trotting, cantering, and then, at the moment of contact with the Ottoman lines, full gallop. The heavy war horses carrying armoured riders at the speed that heavy war horses achieve only in the last 50 metres before impact. The lances lowered, the formation tightening rather than opening as the riders brought themselves together in the way that shock cavalry does when it is about to hit something. Sobieski rode at the head of 3,000 winged hussars. The wings, those strange and somehow magnificent constructions of wood and raptor feathers that marked the Polish heavy cavalry as something distinct from anything else on the battlefield, caught the evening air as the formation accelerated, producing a sound that had been described in other engagements as a rushing, rattling hiss that was audible above the noise of hooves, and that some Ottoman accounts attributed with having a psychological effect on horses who had not encountered it before. The armoured riders, in their engraved breastplates, their helmets with their distinctive neck guards, their long lances tipped with steel and decorated with the coloured pennants that identified their unit. They were, whatever their practical military effectiveness, a sight that did not belong to the ordinary visual vocabulary of war. They were something older and stranger. Something that looked like what armies looked like when people still believed that God took sides in specific battles and made his preference visible. The Ottoman defensive line, which had been holding under pressure all day against the grinding advance of the German and Austrian infantry, was already compromised. But compromised and broken are different things, and the men facing the Polish cavalry in the late afternoon light had not broken. They had pulled back from some positions. They had lost contact with their right wing. They were fighting on 2 fronts. But they were still there. And when the mass of cavalry came down the slope, there were Ottoman troops who stood their ground and discharged their weapons into the oncoming formation and killed men and horses with the systematic efficiency of soldiers who have been trained to do exactly this. Lances broke. Horses went down, men fell, but the formation did not stop. The physics of heavy cavalry at full gallop is not a function of individual courage or individual decision-making. It is a function of mass and velocity, and the mass and velocity of 18,000 horses carrying armoured riders down a slope into a defensive line that was already under pressure from 3 directions simultaneously was simply more than the line could absorb. The Ottoman centre fractured. The fracture began at the point of Sobieski's personal charge, the place where the hussars hit the line at the highest speed, where the lances struck with the most force, and spread outward in both directions the way a crack spreads through glass, each failure creating the conditions for the next one. Kara Mustafa saw it. He was still on the Turkenschanze, the holy banner in his hand, watching the cavalry charge from the position he had occupied for the last 2 hours of the battle. He understood, in the moment the centre broke, that the calculation had been wrong. The city had not fallen in time. The relief army had attacked faster and with more coordination than he had expected. The Janissaries in the trenches, his best troops, the men who might have made a difference if they had been deployed to face the relief army instead of continuing to work the siege tunnels, were not going to be able to reorganize quickly enough to matter. He made one more attempt. He gathered what cavalry remained near him, the personal guard and the Sipahi units that had stayed close to the center, and he charged. Not in the organized, coordinated way that cavalry charges when it expects to win, but in the desperate way that men charge when they have identified the moment of last possibility and are not prepared to let it pass without contesting it. The charge went into German cannon and musket fire. His personal secretary died. His Albanian bodyguard died. The men closest to him died. Someone with enough authority and enough sense grabbed his horse's bridle and told him that his death would accomplish nothing and would seal the destruction of the Ottoman forces more completely than his survival would, and he allowed himself to be pulled away. He ran. The word is not unfair to what happened, though it requires context. Kara Mustafa was not a coward in any simple sense. The personal charge he had just attempted demonstrated that he was capable of placing himself in mortal danger when he believed it was necessary. But he ran because there was nothing left to do but run. The Ottoman covering army was in full rout. The Janissaries in the siege trenches were being overrun from behind, their carefully constructed positions useless now that the attackers were already inside the perimeter. The mines under Vienna's walls, those weeks of work, those tunnels that had been within hours of being ready, were being discovered and defused by the garrison, even as the Ottoman engineers who had built them were fleeing the area. The loot, the supplies, the artillery that had cost weeks of work to position, the livestock, the thousands of individual items of personal equipment that an army of 170,000 men accumulates over the course of a campaign. All of it was left. The red tent, the exotic animals, the caged birds, the fountain that the engineers had built for the Grand Vizier's comfort, the sacks of unroasted coffee beans from the Ottoman supply stores. All of it left behind, abandoned in the speed of a retreat that needed to be faster than the pursuing cavalry could follow. The cavalry followed anyway. The winged hussars and the lighter Polish cavalry that supported them ranged through the Ottoman camp and the country south of it, until the light gave out and the horses were too tired to continue, killing men who had nowhere to go and collecting prisoners who had decided that surrender to the Polish cavalry was preferable to the alternative. The Ottoman army, which had arrived before Vienna in July as the most formidable military force in the world, retreated south toward Hungary in fragments, harried and degraded, leaving behind it a battlefield that would take the victorious armies and the surviving population of Vienna more than a week to fully inventory. Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, who had not left the walls of Vienna in 60 days, came down when the Ottoman lines were clearly abandoned, and walked through what remained of the siege works with the careful attention of a man trying to understand exactly how close it had been. What he found in the tunnels under the walls was that the mines were further advanced than he had known. A few more hours, perhaps less. He went back to the city and received John III Sobieski at its gates. And when the Polish king rode through, Starhemberg, a man who had ordered soldiers shot for sleeping and who had maintained the posture of absolute command for 2 months in conditions designed to break it, embraced Sobieski and called him his saviour. The word was accurate. The accounting came slowly, because accounting after a battle of this scale always comes slowly, and because there was so much to account for. On the Ottoman side, the dead numbered at least 15,000, killed in the battle on the hills and in the rout that followed, in the massacre of the soldiers still trapped in the siege trenches when the perimeter collapsed, in the fighting retreat toward Hungary that stretched across days and hundreds of miles. Another 5,000 or more had been captured, including large numbers of Janissary infantry who had been cut off in the tunnels and had no realistic option except surrender. The artillery, every cannon the Ottoman army had brought to the siege, was captured intact or destroyed in place. The supply stores, enormous by any standard of military provisioning, fell to the victors. And the equipment, the tents, the livestock, the personal goods, the weapons and armour, and the accumulated material of one of the largest military campaigns of the century. Sobieski described it in a letter to his wife as treasure beyond description. Cattle and sheep by the thousands, camels, exotic birds in their cages, gold and silver plate from the personal baggage of the senior commanders. He did not exaggerate. The relief force and the Vienna garrison together lost approximately 4,500 dead and wounded, a significant number, reflecting the genuine difficulty of the fighting in the morning hours especially. But small against the scale of the victory and against the alternative, which was the fall of a city of 60,000 survivors and the strategic collapse of the Habsburg position in Central Europe that would inevitably have followed. Starhemberg walked his walls in the days after the battle with the eye of a commander assessing damage. And what he found was sobering, even in victory. The Theodosian-style bastion fortifications that Vienna had built in the 16th century had been seriously degraded. The Ottoman mining operations had come within literal hours of their objectives in at least 2 critical sections. The walls would need complete reconstruction before they could be considered reliable again. He ordered work to begin immediately, not because he expected the Ottomans to return. The direction of things was now sufficiently clear that even the most pessimistic assessment of the future did not include another Ottoman siege of Vienna within the foreseeable future. But because a city without walls is a city that has lost something more than stone. It had lost the particular confidence that comes from knowing that the worst can be withstood. For the men who had been in the Ottoman siege trenches, those janissaries who had survived the rout and been taken prisoner, who were now being marched west in columns with their hands bound, the experience of the preceding months had produced something that contemporaries would not have had the vocabulary to describe, but that later generations would recognize as a specific psychological state. The state of men who have been the most feared military force in the world, and have just discovered, in the most complete and final way possible, that the fear was not unlimited. That there were men and formations and commanders who could be put in front of them and would not give way. The Janissary Corps would survive the defeat at Vienna. It would fight again and would fight well. But something had changed in the relationship between the Corps and the empire it served. A change that would contribute, in the decades that followed, to the political instability that would make the Ottoman response to subsequent Holy League offensives less effective than it might otherwise have been. Kara Mustafa reached Belgrade in October and began, immediately and characteristically, the process of deflecting blame for the defeat onto his subordinate commanders. He ordered executions. Some of the senior officers who had commanded units in the battle were killed in the weeks after the retreat, presented to Ottoman chroniclers as punishment for their failures in the field. The executions did not help. The Sultan's court, which had received a thorough account of the campaign from multiple sources by the time Kara Mustafa arrived in Belgrade, was not persuaded that the disaster at Vienna was primarily the result of subordinate incompetence. On Christmas Day, 1683, a Janissary officer arrived at Kara Mustafa Pasha's quarters in Belgrade, carrying a silk cord. The Grand Vizier, who had led the largest Ottoman army of the century to the walls of Vienna, who had calculated that the golden apple was finally within reach, who had refused to leave the city's walls even when the calculation was clearly failing, was strangled. His skull, which was sent to the Sultan as proof of execution in the manner of the time, eventually found its way to the Vienna City Museum, where it sits to this day under a glass case, regarded by tourists who mostly do not know whose it is. The 60 days of the Vienna siege and the single day of the Battle of Kahlenberg did not, by themselves, end the Ottoman Empire. Empires are not ended in a day, and the Ottoman state had resources and resilience and institutional inertia that would keep it functioning for another 2.5 centuries. Through defeats and recoveries and long periods of relative stability, before finally dissolving in the aftermath of the First World War. What the battle ended was a direction, the specific trajectory of Ottoman expansion into Central and Western Europe that had been the dominant feature of the continent's strategic situation for 150 years. The Holy League that Pope Innocent XI organized in the year following the battle, drawing in the Habsburg Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Venice, and eventually Russia, in a coalition that was unprecedented in its breadth and its commitment to sustained offensive operations against the Ottomans, spent the next 16 years systematically undoing the territorial gains that a century of Ottoman expansion had accumulated. Buda, the Ottoman capital in Hungary, fell to Habsburg forces in 1686, the first time since 1541 that a Christian army had held the city, a symbolic and strategic reversal of enormous importance. Belgrade fell to the same forces in 1688. In 1697, at the Battle of Zenta, Prince Eugene of Savoy, a 24-year-old volunteer who had participated in the relief of Vienna 14 years earlier as a young man and had built his career on the opportunities that the subsequent war created, caught the main Ottoman army in the process of crossing a river and destroyed it in an afternoon, killing the Grand Vizier and most of the senior command. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized what the preceding decade and a half of warfare had established. The Ottomans ceded most of Hungary, Transylvania, and significant portions of the Balkans to the Habsburg monarchy, recognized Polish territorial claims in the east, and accepted, for the first time in the empire's history, a general peace that acknowledged the reversal of its European expansion. It was, Ottoman chroniclers noted, with a precision that captures the magnitude of the moment, the first time the empire had ever accepted such terms. The empire that had never given ground was giving ground. The tactical lesson that European armies drew from Vienna was less about the cavalry charge, which was already an increasingly transitional element of 17th century warfare, and more about coalition command. What Sobieski had achieved in 6 days was something that European commanders regularly failed to achieve in 6 months. A multinational force of 70,000 men, speaking multiple languages, following different military traditions, owing loyalty to different sovereigns, had been organized into a single coherent battle plan and had executed it with sufficient coordination to defeat an opponent who was, in raw numbers, roughly comparable in strength. This was not primarily a function of military genius, though Sobieski was a very good commander. It was a function of the particular conditions that obtained at Vienna, the simplicity of the objective, the clarity of the stakes, the geographic compression of the problem, and the existence of a single commander whose seniority all parties accepted and whose operational judgment all parties were willing, in this specific situation, to trust. The lesson that subsequent European armies drew from this, that coalition warfare required unified command, clear operational objectives, and a willingness among coalition members to subordinate national preference to collective effectiveness, would take another century and more to be fully institutionalized. But the example was there, in the record of what happened on September 12, 1683, and the commanders who came after Sobieski and Lorraine could point to it. John III Sobieski returned to Poland in the aftermath of the battle with the prestige of a man who had saved Christian Europe. A prestige so large and so universally acknowledged that it paradoxically made the remainder of his reign more difficult rather than less. He was the greatest king of his time in the estimation of almost everyone outside Poland. And inside Poland, he was a great king who could not translate his military achievement into the political authority he needed to reform a state that was already beginning its long decline. The noble veto system that would eventually paralyze Polish governance was already active, already limiting what any Polish monarch could accomplish, regardless of his personal qualities or his external reputation. He fought further campaigns against the Ottomans in subsequent years, but achieved nothing that matched Vienna. And he died in 1696, having been unable to secure the Polish throne for his son. He was, as one of his biographers noted, the last strong native king of Poland. The country that had produced the most decisive military intervention in the history of European Ottoman conflict was already being hollowed out by the political conditions that would eventually lead to its disappearance from the map of Europe entirely. This is the particular sadness of September 12, 1683, when you look at it from sufficient distance. The victory was real, and its consequences were enormous, and its effects on the subsequent history of Europe were exactly as significant as contemporaries believed them to be in the immediate aftermath. And yet, the men who won it were not, most of them, the people who profited most from the winning of it. The Poles who rode down the Kahlenberg that afternoon had saved a city and an empire and a civilization in the judgment of the people who lived through the following century, and their reward was a state that continued to weaken through the 18th century until it was partitioned out of existence in 1795. The Viennese, who held the walls for 60 days, received their city back and would live for 2 more centuries under the Habsburg dynasty that their stubbornness had preserved. Starhemberg received honours and a long career. The Janissaries, who died in the trenches, received nothing except the designation of martyrs in a faith tradition that took martyrdom seriously. Kahlenberg Mountain today is, as the outline suggested it would be, a place where people go to have coffee and look at the view. There is a restaurant near the summit, and on clear days the view of Vienna below is as good as it was in September 1683, when the commanders of the Holy League stood on this ridge in the evening light and looked down at what they were about to try to save. The Church of St. Joseph, where Mark of Aviano celebrated Mass before the battle, was rebuilt after the siege and has been rebuilt several times since. A plaque commemorates the Mass. There is a statue of Sobieski near the Augustinerkirche in Vienna's inner city, and there are plaques and markers and museum exhibits across the city that reference the siege. The Ottoman cannonball embedded in the wall at Amhof, the fragments of the fortifications that can still be seen in certain cellars in the old city, the collections in the Kunsthistorisches Museum that include the captured Ottoman tent that Sobieski claimed as his personal war prize, and which still smells, slightly, of a different century. The skull in the Vienna City Museum, attributed to Kara Mustafa Pasha, sits in its glass case and does not comment on any of this. Whether the attribution is correct is a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. The Ottoman Grand Vizier, who came closest to taking the Golden Apple, who left his mines ready and his tunnels dug under the walls of a city that held for 60 days and was still holding when help arrived, his remains may or may not be in that case. History does not always provide the clean endings that the storytelling instinct demands. What it does provide in the record of September 12, 1683, is one of those rare days when the direction of history was genuinely in doubt and was genuinely decided by what happened in the space of about 15 hours. The Ottoman advance into Europe had been building for a century and a half. The conditions for its reversal had been assembling for several years. The treaty between Leopold and Sobieski, the papal diplomacy of Innocent XI, the organisational work of men like Charles of Lorraine, who had spent years building the military capacity the Holy League would need. But the moment of reversal itself was September 12th, and it was decided by the particular combination of a defensive commander who refused to sleep on watch, a Grand Vizier who left his heavy guns behind because he wanted to arrive fast and stayed in the tunnels because he wanted to take the city whole, and a king who threw away the wrong maps and trusted his own eyes, and who knew when the moment had arrived because he had spent 30 years learning what the right moment felt like. Centuries later, the hills above Vienna are still covered with vineyards. The vines have been replanted many times since 1683. The wine they produce is considered very good. On a clear September morning, standing among them with a glass and looking down at the city below, the Baroque churches and the imperial palaces and the boulevards that replaced the walls that held, you can almost hear, if the wind is right, the particular silence that falls over a battlefield after everything has been decided, and the noise stops, and the magnitude of what just happened begins to become apparent. Almost. Not quite. The dead are too far away. The distance of 340 years is too great. But almost. The golden apple is still there. It was never taken. And somewhere in the vineyards, if you know where to look, there are still places where the Ottoman siege trenches ran. Shallow depressions in the earth, barely visible, slowly filling with centuries of fallen leaves. The men who dug them are dust. The empire that sent them is gone. The city they came to conquer is still there, still standing, still making music and coffee, and the particular Viennese art of elegant survival in the face of historical forces that should have been overwhelming. The winged hussars are gone too, of course. The era of heavy shock cavalry that they represented was already passing in 1683, and the charge down the Kahlenberg was their high watermark, and their last great moment simultaneously. The wings in their museums are extraordinary objects, enormous and impractical, and somehow beautiful. They look like something that could not possibly have worked. And yet they did. On one September afternoon, in the light of the setting sun, against an army of 170,000, they worked. History remembered what happened that day. The Ottoman chroniclers called it a disaster. The European chroniclers called it a miracle. Sobieski called it God's victory, and left it at that. They were all, in their different ways, correct.